Thank you.
Meanwhile, 4 minutes after the hour, President Trump says progress is being made in peace talks to end the war between Russia and Ukraine, as his special envoy is expected to travel to Moscow next week to keep the momentum going.
Benjamin Hall joins us live from London with more. Benjamin.
Yeah, hi, Emily. And look, well, yes, I was going to say, look, at the moment there is some cautious optimism, but still a lot of hurdles still to be that have to be gotten over. At the moment, both Ukraine and Russia have agreed with the US on the main points that they would agree for a peace deal. The big question remains, can these two countries meet in the middle and agree with one another? Speaking on Air Force One yesterday, President Trump said there was no longer a deadline for this, but progress was being made.
Do you have a new deadline or a deal?
No, I don't have a deadline. You know what the deadline for me is? When it's over. And I think everybody's tired of fighting at this moment. We're having some talks with Russia. Ukraine is doing well. I think they're pretty happy about it. They'd like to see it end. And we won't know for a little while, but we're making progress.
So Ukraine have now largely agreed on their 19-point deal, but they say there are still some minor details that still need to be resolved. And frankly, those minor details, they are large ones. They are the security guarantees. Will there be some kind of an Article 5 from the US guaranteeing Ukrainian safety? And of course, territorial swaps. Russia wants the remainder of the Donbass handed over to it, and Ukraine simply is against that. And future NATO membership is a big issue still to be discussed, and the future limit on the size of the Ukrainian army once the war is over. So big questions, even though they are moving in the right direction. Now, Russia has sort of responded in a couple of different ways. The Kremlin spokesman saying this could now be a good basis for future talks. But the Foreign Minister Lavrov saying European countries yesterday blew their chances of ending the war because of the changes they had made to the Russian 28-point plan. Now, interestingly, the Wall Street Journal is now reporting that Putin used a phone call to Trump last month to convince President Trump he should not be sending Ukraine those long-range Tomahawk missiles. Now, that call was reportedly arranged after the president's peace envoy, Steve Witkoff, urged a Russian official to have Putin pick up the phone to Trump for wider discussion. So really interesting to see behind the scenes on how those negotiations were going on. And Witkoff is going to Moscow next week to move this forward as well. So, look, they're moving in the right directions. All the sides are talking, but some major key issues which both Russia and Ukraine are still far apart on.
So Benjamin, that whole call was leaked out, and it looks, even though the president said he's not upset by it, he told Putin, basically, make sure you compliment the president up front. Make sure you say that he's a president of peace. I don't think that anybody on the American side should be coaching anybody on the Russian side. Do you?
Yeah, it's a totally new form of diplomacy, that is certain. And certainly other diplomats going back for the last few decades in the US have said they would never be reaching out to effectively the aggressors, the opponents, and suggesting how they could sway the president. And that's effectively what Witkoff was doing. He was saying the first thing President Putin must do is really praise President Trump on how he's moving towards peace, on how he's doing all these great things. And look, that may well be true, but to suggest to the Russians that they should do that in a phone call that led to President Trump pulling back on giving Tomahawks to Ukraine is frankly new. But President Trump spoke about this just yesterday, and he said, look, this is how negotiations go. You have to reach out to one side and say, bring them to the table. You have to reach out to the other and bring them to the table. So in President Trump's mind, this is how business happens. You have to reach out to all sides. But yes, very different form of diplomacy than we have ever seen, and a lot of criticism perhaps that Witkoff was coaching the Russians on how best for Putin to reach out and approach President Trump.
You know, Ben, going back to this deal, it seems that one of the main sticking points is, of course, the territorial concessions. And whether or not President Zelensky agrees to it or not, is it still the case that under the Ukrainian constitution, any territorial concession has to be voted on in a national referendum before that can occur?
Yeah, that is absolutely true. And again, this is not a part of land that they have been fighting over for the last 3.5 years. This part of Donbass they've been fighting over for 11 years. This is called the sort of ring of steel of Ukraine. And effectively, President Putin wants it to be handed over because then there is nothing stopping the Russian military from moving further into Ukraine and capturing the whole country. So, look, this is probably going to be the one big sticking point. Ukraine, whether it could vote or not, is very unlikely to hand over its key cities in this area. And President Putin seems unwilling at this point, despite the huge loss of lives. Over 1 million soldiers in Russia killed or injured, but seems unwilling to stop this war unless he gets what he wants. And that really is going to be the difficult part moving forward.
And Benjamin, he's lost 200,000 soldiers, 200,000, and he thinks he's winning. The other thing to point out, estimates are it will take 3 years for them to get all of Donetsk or the Donbass region. So it's not falling imminently. And lastly, in the big picture, don't you think it would help if the president said, hey, I'm going to put the Senate sanctions on, Tomahawks are going to get delivered if you guys don't come to the table and legitimately try to deal, meaning the Russians, because the president has put pressure on the Ukrainians before.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And look, at the phone call in which President Putin persuaded President Trump not to give Ukraine the Tomahawks, that shows what leverage they really are. And actually, now if Russia doesn't come to the table, that seems to be the next step. You know, we've got the sanctions in place. You could put more secondary sanctions. But those Tomahawks, that will make Russia, and not just Russia, but it will make the people of Moscow and St. Petersburg, which are really Putin key areas, that'll make them feel the pain. It'll make the queues for gas longer. It'll make the prices higher. And that's what you perhaps need to do to swing President Putin. So President Trump has that up his sleeve. He has the Tomahawks, and maybe if Russia doesn't come to the table now, after the Ukraine and US have agreed on this 19-point plan, perhaps the Tomahawks is still a way to go, and President Putin, or rather President Trump, could still use those.
Indeed. Benjamin Hall, thank you so much for that incredible analysis, as always.
Hey everyone, I'm Emily Campagno. Catch me and my co-hosts Harris Faulkner and Kaylee McEnany on Outnumbered every weekday at 12 p.m. Eastern, or set your DVR. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page for daily highlights.